Do you know the most dangerous sound that you can hear in a church building? It's what you just heard. Did you catch it? It's silence. The most dangerous thing you can hear in a church building, the thing that should sound like alarm bells going off, is silence. Next Sunday, when you're sitting in your service, if you can only hear your preacher preaching and it is complete silence all around, and you don't hear any little voices, any little fussing, any goldfish crumbling, anyone coloring as they lay under the pew, that should be an alarm bell to the congregation. What I mean to say is if you hear no little voices, no little squeaks, no little cries, or maybe even some big cries coming from little lungs, that should sound like an alarm bell going off for the church. Where I pastor, on the average Sunday, you're going to hear a lot of little voices. You're going to hear a lot of cries. We have babies coming out of our ears, and we have a lot of young families. And I always want to remind them that they are always welcome in the house of God. Why? Because first and foremost, Jesus Christ literally said, "Bring the children unto me." So, it's kind of important to Jesus. But it's also true that a lot of parents and a lot of families feel a lot of anxiety about bringing their little kids to church because what if they cry? And to that, I would say, what if they do? To that, I would say, if you hear no cries, you're in a far worse state as a congregation than if you hear some cries. I understand. It can be difficult at times for some of the adults around to focus because a baby's crying, or can even be difficult to hear. In my 8 years pastoring as a teaching pastor and preaching the majority of Sundays, I've never once had a parent just stay in service while their kid is completely losing their mind. They get up and it takes maybe 30, 40 seconds or a minute to get them out. And then they go calm the child down and bounce them in the hallway or whatever. And then they try and come back in. They've never once just sat there. So church, are we saying that we can't sit there for 30, 40 seconds and process as mom and dad take care of their screaming child? Beyond that, are we saying we would rather be a congregation where we never hear the cry of a child or the fussiness of a 2-year-old or the 4-year-old coloring underneath the pew or whatever noise the child is making? That we would want to make sure that we always heard the sermon no matter what? Because I think if we're honest, we need to recognize that if we hear no cries, that's the actual alarm bell that we should have going off in our ears. If we hear no fussiness, that's the concern we should have and say, we're missing that entire next generation. Because if you hear no cries today, that means in 20 years, there may be no one there. So the next time you're worried about the child being fussy in church, remember that the most dangerous sound you can hear in a church is not a baby crying, but is silence. And the parent, bring your children to church. Bring your children to gather and worship with the church. And if they cry, let them praise the Lord with their little lungs. And if you go to a church where they're not welcome and they're not welcomed in and the pastor flips out because he thinks he's so self-important that his sermon is the most important thing, and if your baby cries, it won't happen that week, go find a place that welcomes your children in, because it's the literal words of Jesus Christ. And we want you to bring your kids to church. The most dangerous thing you can hear in church is not a baby crying. The most dangerous thing might very well be not ever hearing that.